I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor, and I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast. Hello again, and welcome to another episode of the Editing Podcast. So this week, we're going to chat about editing and proofreading services agreements.
Now, we want to make it clear that we're not here to draft a template contract for anyone.
Goodness me, no.
No. What your agreements will need to include to be legally sound and workable for you will depend on factors that are specific to where you and your clients are based and what kind of work you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely right. Instead, what we thought we'd do is discuss some considerations, ones that ensure that you're communicating clearly and professionally with the client, and including information that clearly outlines expectations and responsibilities.
And that way, you're safeguarding your interests as an editor and ensuring that there are no surprises when the invoice lands in your client's inbox. And I think that's a strong foundation for a good working relationship during the projects and prompt payment when the project's complete.
Exactly. So the first thing to include is probably the obvious, but excluding it would make a nonsense of the services agreement. So we're saying it anyway. So go on, Denise.
Okay, so you need to identify who the parties are. For example, you and your client. Simple.
Simple indeed. So the next thing to include is the scope of the job. What are you going to be working on and what will you be doing?
Yes, so are you offering proofreading, copy editing, line editing, or developmental editing? Or will you be acting as a project manager or an indexer or a typesetter?
And your client should understand also how you're defining those terms. Whether you include that in your contract or link to information elsewhere is for you to decide, but it should be there.
Yeah, and that's an important point because anyone who's worked in this industry for any length of time knows that the terminology around editing services is, to put it politely, sometimes quite tangled. So ensuring that everyone's expectations are on the same page is essential.
Absolutely. Tangled.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So our next element is, of course, the agreed fee or rate for the job. So have you agreed a flat fee, regardless of how long the project takes, or will you be working to an hourly rate or a per word rate?
And if you're working to an hourly rate, is there an expectation of how long the job will take? If so, make sure that that's recorded along with any agreed review process, should there need to be one.
And be sure to clarify which currency you're working in too. Dollars and pounds, for example, are used in multiple countries and have different exchange values. So make sure you include the detail here.
Definitely, yeah. And don't forget to include any additional charges such as tax. For example, some UK-based editors might be VAT registered, VAT, and if your client's going to end up with a chunky percentage added to their bill, this needs to be agreed and made clear up front. Now, sticking with money for a moment, your agreement needs to make it clear when any payments will be due. There may be more than one deadline depending on the model that you've agreed with your client.
Yeah, and so you might have agreed a down payment or several instalments at particular stages of the project. We mentioned this in a different episode, didn't we, Denise?
Yeah.
On invoicing, getting paid faster.
Yeah.
Or you might be working on short form content and have agreed on a monthly retainer for several months.
Yeah, and if there are late payment fees or interest penalties in the event of delayed payment, these need to be recorded too.
Yeah. And it's also worth making sure that the agreement records which payment methods will be acceptable. So if your client refuses to use Stripe or PayPal, but they're the only gateways you've set up, you'll come unstuck when it's payment time.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
haven't got
definitely.
that up front in the agreement.
We don't want that surprise hitting us when all the work's been done. Now, you might also want to state when the invoice will be issued and when the payment will be due. So perhaps you'll invoice at the end of the project and expect payment within 30 days.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you. But again, just make sure there are no surprises. So a robust services agreement should also record when the content will be delivered by the client and when you, the editor, will deliver the completed project, all the agreed installments.
And this is important because you don't want to be tied to delivering a project by a particular date, even though your client's delivered it late. It happens all the time.
I'll need that by tomorrow.
Yes.
And that might mean making it clear in your services agreement what will happen to down payments like deposits if the client doesn't deliver on the agreed date.
Yeah, and that's so important because many editors have found themselves in situations whereby the client is unable to deliver the content by the agreed date and asks for an extension, but the editor is then left twiddling their thumbs, having turned down work so they could complete this original project.
Yeah, yeah. And when you're self-employed, that means you're not earning.
Yep.
So something else that's really crucial but often overlooked is the revision and feedback process. So it won't do you any harm if your agreement also states what space there is for feedback and revisions and what the scope of that looks like.
Yeah, and you might want to specify the format for the feedback. For example, will you be annotating documents? Will you be adding comments to a shared file or talking through the project via a Zoom call?
Yeah. And think about how many hours that you'll agree to commit to that work if it's required.
Yeah, because it can get out of hand quite quickly, can't it?
And I don't think you always need to be exact, but
No.
giving the client an idea of what, so that you both know what you think is acceptable. No,
Yeah.
you're not going to do another 20 hours work, but yes, an hour Zoom call or an hour and a half on checking through some queries they have is fine.
Yeah. It's when things aren't clear and assumptions are made, that's where we come
Yeah,
unstuck, really, isn't
yeah.
it? Yeah.
So next up is confidentiality and ownership. I think it's really important that we're clear about who owns what so that the client's work is protected, but the editor's intellectual property is too.
So perhaps until you've been paid, the amendments in the edited file are owned by you, and after that, ownership transfers to the author. Or perhaps you'll retain some rights for portfolio use.
Yeah. It's also a good idea to include a confidentiality clause that states your commitment to not disclosing your client's content or their personal information to third parties without their permission.
Some clients sometimes might even want non-disclosure agreements or NDAs included in the agreement.
Yeah.
hmm
Yeah, definitely. There. I mean, I that rarely happens with me, but I know people who've worked for some really big brand names,
Mm,
and they're not even they often have to sign agreements saying that they won't even mention on their website that they worked for that
yeah,
client.
yeah.
So
And some clients, I mean, I've been asked to sign NDAs before they even start discussing any work with you, so you don't even know what
yeah,
you're
yeah. What you're
agreeing
going to be
not to
doing?
talk about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so now let's look at termination clauses. And these are a good example of something that no one likes to think about, but actually they're essential. So your client needs to understand the circumstances under which either party can terminate the contract.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit like insurance, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's kind of
yeah.
like it's something that you don't ever want to think about having an accident, but you're really glad you've got insurance when you
Mhm.
when you do.
Yeah.
So we're talking here about what the associated consequences are. So for example, this could include compensation for any work completed, which materials are going to be returned, or a booking deposit not being refunded. What this basically does is provide you with a safety net in case the collaboration takes an unexpected turn.
Yeah, and we just can't anticipate when these things might happen,
No, you
no
can't.
matter how friendly and nice everybody is. When these things happen, you need to have something in writing that
Yeah,
protects
yeah.
all parties, really. Yeah.
And it doesn't always happen for malevolent reasons. It can happen for benevolent reasons, but it's still, and it might be that you decide to respect a difficulty that your clients come into, and that maybe you waive the
Yeah.
clause that you put in. But actually having it there as a fundamental starting point is
Yep.
won't do you any harm.
Everybody's clear on
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So next up, so next up is legalities and governing law. So which governing law will apply if there's a dispute? That always needs to go in your services agreement.
Yeah, and that's important because you and the client both need to be aware of the jurisdiction under which the contract operates. And if you're working with clients from different countries from the jurisdiction you're operating, it's best to get legal advice if you really, really want to make sure that you're
Yeah.
covered in the event that goes. Because it might well be that if your contract operates, say in the case of me, um, for England and Wales, that if Denise screwed me over,
Mm-hmm.
she might, say, well, no, I'm in Scotland. That doesn't
Yeah.
count there. And so,
Yeah.
if that's
And
something you've
then
got to be
and then
aware
there
of.
would be no more podcasts because we wouldn't be speaking to each other.
Oh
That'll
my
never
goodness.
happen.
No.
No. But you never know. So yeah, it's important to understand these parameters that we're working
Mm.
in. Yeah. So another element worth including in your agreement is the preferred method of communication. And that way, your client and you are agreeing upfront about what's preferable and what each person has access to.
Yeah, so will it be by email, phone, Zoom, WhatsApp, or a project management tool? And perhaps not consider not just how, but when too. The services agreement is a really good place to make it clear what your working hours and days are and in which time zone you're
Yeah.
operating.
Yeah. And what is and isn't acceptable.
Yeah,
Because, some clients will expect your full attention unreasonably
yeah,
and want continuous updates. And that's not how most editors work. So,
no.
get that in place. That is, unless you want to receive text messages demanding an update on the progress at 3 in the morning. Maybe some people are okay with that.
And on that uncomfortable thought, we'd like to thank you once again for listening.
Yes. So if you'd like to help support the Editing Podcast, we've got a couple of options for you. And the first is that you can tip us with a one-off donation of your choosing.
Or you can join our Patreon community. All our patrons get exclusive access to a huge batch of transcripts.
And the links for both of these options are in the show notes. In the meantime, she's been Louise.
And she's been Denise. Join us again soon.
Bye.